Aaron, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure thing. So my name is Aaron Preston. I'm a professor of philosophy at Valparaiso University in Valparaiso, Indiana. I did my PhD at the University of Southern California back in the late 90s, early 2000s, under the supervision of Dallas Willard.
Awesome. And today we're going to talk about moral knowledge. Give you a little background on your work in moral knowledge and your position regarding the disappearance of moral knowledge.
Right. So the phrase you just uttered there, the disappearance of moral knowledge, is the title of a book that my mentor Dallas Willard was working on at the time of his death in 2013. He handed this project off to me and a couple of my grad school friends who are also professors of philosophy to finish for him. And we did finish that book. It was published in 2018. And the thesis of that book is essentially that in the 20th century, we saw, we in the West broadly and in America specifically, saw a phenomenon that Dallas calls the disappearance of moral knowledge. And that is a shift from a position where the major institutions of our culture, things like law, government, education, the professions, and so on, were operating on a basis of at least presumed moral knowledge, a shift from that position to a position where we are no longer operating on a presumed basis of moral knowledge. And part of the story there is that we've sort of lost faith in the possibility of moral knowledge. And the book then traces philosophy's contribution, or at least analytic philosophy's contribution to the disappearance of this moral knowledge. But it's not just a philosophical phenomenon, it's a cultural phenomenon.
Could you explain more about that? Because most of the people I talk to claim to be, I forget what the term is, the term where you're like on a moral high horse.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So everyone thinks they have great moral knowledge and no one else does except their individual self.
Yeah. Well, that's, I'm not sure exactly who you talk to and what position they're taking, but making assertions of moral knowledge is one thing, but actually operating as if you were in possession of moral knowledge is another. One of the things that when we make a claim to knowledge, one of the things that occurs there is we subject ourselves to standards of rational scrutiny. And so a person who's overly certain about their supposed moral knowledge probably is not really operating within the realm of knowledge itself. They're operating somewhere in the domain of faith or dogmatism. And so I would want to distance the idea of moral knowledge from over-assurance. Knowledge involves the idea of a rationally based assurance, but there's also then the idea that, well, your basis could be faulty or inadequate, and you need to be open to new evidence and so on and so forth. So entering into a rational dialogue about your views about what constitutes moral knowledge is part of what you subject yourself to when you make a claim to moral knowledge. Being on a moral high horse is not usually a good thing. In fact, some people might say that's contrary to actual moral knowledge. So you take certain folks that many are inclined to regard as moral exemplars, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, et cetera, right? And these folks are not folks that we would think of as being on a moral high horse exactly, although they do occupy a kind of elevated position in our minds and occupied a place of authority in their day to speak to moral matters. But they were open to discussion and correction and so on. And so that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about when I talk about moral knowledge, not being on a moral high horse.
So could you give me an example of how that's been lost over time? What do you mean when you say that institutions have lost that?
Yeah, so one of the interesting phenomena that occurred, well, maybe it would be useful if we go back a bit and trace some of the major moves that led to the disappearance of moral knowledge. One of the things that happened in the early 20th century in the American university and this has been traced out in a book called The Making of the Modern University by an author named Julie Rubin. In the early American colleges, before they were really called universities, there was a presumption that there was a body of moral knowledge, and it could be taught, it could be conveyed just by speaking, that one had duties of specific sorts that they needed to know about, and that these were just as assured in terms of knowledge as, say, knowing mathematical truths or scientific truths. But over the course of the first few decades of the 20th century, movements arose in the social sciences and in philosophy that rejected the idea that moral claims had any cognitive content at all. And in philosophy, we usually refer to this as emotivism. The idea was that moral utterances didn't make factual claims, they merely were expressions of feeling or taste or sentiment. And so they ended up pointing in the direction of a kind of subjectivism in morality. And this then was, this type of view was ensconced in the American university system as that sort of transition from being colleges to research universities, in the form of curricular changes. And Rubin traces all of this out, but the basic idea here is that in the early American colleges, you'd have what we would now call a capstone course on moral philosophy, where you would try to draw together all the threads of your education and see how they all fit together into a worldview that showed human life as oriented to moral and spiritual ends. And then through various curricular revisions, that was jettisoned. And what came to take the place of moral education as traditionally conceived was general education. And general education then gave way to a system of electives, where people just take what they're interested in. And moral education was sort of shuffled off, according to Rubin, to the arts and humanities that would try to teach material that would be inspiring to people, and on an emotional level, and then also to sort of co-curricular activities like intramural sports. The idea was, this would be a kind of character building exercise to participate in intramural sports. So you go from a cognitively oriented field where you could actually teach content to courses that were more focused on emotional inspiration, or, if we want to take a cynical view, manipulation, and then participation in group activities like sport as a kind of moral formation. And then sort of on the tail end of this, you have the influx of continental or postmodern thought in the universities. And this created the situation that Harold Bloom wrote about in the 80s, in The Closing of the American Mind, where a certain kind of relativism came to dominate people's thinking about morality. And that has given way in our age to a kind of moral high horseism, to use your earlier phrase, where without paying any attention to the rational basis of these beliefs, people have come to insist upon their own moral views as if they were matters of knowledge. And I think you see this occurring, for example, in the phenomenon of wokeism. People are very, very convinced that they have true views about what constitutes justice and injustice, and true views about how to right historical wrongs and so forth. And they are asserting this vehemently, but it's tearing our culture apart. So historically speaking, that's the sort of thing that I have in mind when I speak of the disappearance of moral knowledge.
And is this presumably a bad thing? Because if the way we used to teach morality in the past was based off of pseudoscience, kind of like homeopathy or something, and then things that we used to taught once we discovered were baseless, we then get jettisoned from the classroom, seems to make sense that we would do that. And so if the way we used to teach moral knowledge was not grounded in any kind of solid philosophical basis, then it makes sense that we would get rid of it.
It does, but that's not actually how this transition occurred. All right. So what happened is that there's a longstanding, I suppose you might say, debate within the sciences about the status of what we sometimes call soft sciences, human sciences, right? So on the one hand, you have these sort of model sciences like physics and chemistry. And then on the other hand, you've got psychology, sociology, and so on. And things seem to be a bit squishier in those areas. And one of the things that happened in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s was the social sciences really wanted to try to emulate the hard sciences and achieve for themselves some of the acclaim and prestige that went along with being a hard science. And so this is where you see the social scientists insisting on what came to be known as the fact-value distinction. I don't know if that's a familiar notion, but this idea that, well, there are facts, and the domain of fact is circumscribed by what's empirically, confirmable, let's say, empirically observable. And then you've got values, which have nothing to do with fact. They're just based in feeling. It turns out that's not really a sustainable view. It's very difficult to find an adequate rational basis for that view. That turned out to be just a sort of excuse for stepping away from teaching about issues that were not as cut and dried as what you find in physics and in chemistry, but still, ostensibly, are domains of fact. Things are harder to get hold of there, perhaps, and it's more difficult to figure out what the truth actually is. But it's not like these are fact-free domains. The idea that they were fact-free, it simply turned out to be false. And the idea that the moral domain was somehow not being approached in a way that was rationally responsible was only partially true. I mean, certainly various dogmatisms had hold in people's minds there, and that influenced the way that morality was taught in the early American colleges. But that did not entail that there were not also rational bases for at least some of the things that people believed to be true about morality. And instead of a careful separating of the wheat from the chaff, you had a sort of wholesale abandonment of the idea of moral fact and moral knowledge. So I would argue that it does not fit the pattern you described, where we found out that something was purely a matter of pseudoscience and so was rejected.
Well, we had a question from the audience from KCA Randy. When did this change begin?
Well, I mean, you can trace it back. You can trace the historical lines of influence in the realm of ideas, at least, fairly far back in time, to, at the very least, the end of the late medieval period and the beginning of the modern period, at least the way we divide time up in philosophy. So, say 1400s, 1500s, the rise of late medieval nominalism, and then the advent of empiricism as a form of thinking within philosophy. But a more proximate sort of target would be the beginning of the 20th century. It was right there in the last decade or so of the 19th century and the first decade or so of the 20th that you really see people beginning to insist that anything that could be taught as knowledge had to meet the same kinds of cognitive standards that we see in the hard sciences, physics and chemistry. Turns out that's an inappropriate standard for many domains of human life. There's a lot that matters that you just can't know anything about if you insist that we meet those standards in every domain of human life. And so what we have to do is consider the possibility that different domains of knowledge might have different standards of what philosophers call justification, right? Different standards of evidence, we might say, that are particularly applicable within that domain. Right? So I mean, just think about the difference between physics and law. and the different standards of evidence that are acceptable in law that are less than, in terms of their evidentiary value, less than what you might have in running an experiment in physics.
So my question initially would be I tend to agree that the hard science empirical method should be required if we're trying to say something is knowledge. And so I'm a moral realist, so I believe there is objective morality, but I don't think we have sufficient evidence to like really justify that position. We can't say like, oh, here's a test we can run that can demonstrate this model of morality is the correct one. And so it seems like we aren't capable of actually teaching a class on morality. If there is an objective morality out there, we haven't discovered it yet. We don't have access to it. And all the evidence seems to indicate that evolution is the primary drive of moral knowledge or moral beliefs of some kind. And so we don't really have anything to teach when it comes to morality in the coursework. It's all essentially just a subjective system we make up and tend to think is best. But there isn't really a way to ground moral knowledge.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there are two ways we could push on this. One would be to say, we've come to a point, even in the hard sciences, let's take physics for an example, where it's not always clear what the facts are. So, there's something like 24 or more interpretations of quantum mechanics. Maybe only about half a dozen are really popular, but there are lots and lots of interpretations of the observational data of quantum mechanics, right? And even if we just focus on the half dozen or so interpretations that are the most popular ones, you still have some indeterminacy in terms of, which one of these is the correct model. But you can work within those models and say, well, these are the most plausible models based on what we think we know, right? And so the indeterminacy or the uncertainty there doesn't prohibit us from teaching in a way that is hopefully non-dogmatic and is open to alternative, reasonable possibilities, but still isn't open to everything. Some things are excluded entirely. Some things are less plausible than others. We have a few front runners, and we can teach that. And we can teach that in a way that's responsible. And morality might function on a similar sort of model here. There might be certain moral systems, and we don't want to limit ourselves to talking about systems here. I mean, one important view in the history of ethics is one associated with Aristotle. It's called moral particularism, and the idea here is that, well, we're much better at discerning moral facts in particular circumstances or situations. Building systems is something we're not particularly good at in morality, and there are lots of questions that arise around that view. But it doesn't have to be limited to a system. There might be particular moral facts in particular cases that we could all agree on, and we might be able to use those to think about how to make generalizations that would serve as good rules of thumb for the guidance of life, but might be subject to exceptions in particular cases. Like, do not lie. Is that a good rule of thumb? Do we want to teach our children, as a matter of course, you shouldn't lie, but then what do you do with those exception cases where the standard sort of exception cases? Okay, you're
Jews in the basement.
Jews in the basement, right? Yeah, and it's like, well, you've got some folks like Immanuel Kant who rather infamously argued that under no circumstances is it okay to lie. But most of our intuitions point in the opposite direction and say, well, no, and under those circumstances, it would be okay. Maybe not, and might have some disagreement as to whether it's the right thing to do or the least wrong thing to do, and it's just still not desirable but forgivable or acceptable in those circumstances. But still, you're going to have some convergence of opinion and say, well, that's what you ought to do. Whether you want to characterize it as right or least wrong or whatever, you can get into some fine-grained debates about that. And it's not clear to me that we're going to have meetings of a lot of meeting of the minds on that, lots of consensus about that. But you do tend to see a lot of consensus on just what's the right thing to do in the particular case.
Well, my initial questions would be in the case of physics, I don't think the analogy works because in physics, we have a large body of work that we can empirically verify. So we have particles, principles, particles, and laws that can be tested, make novel testable predictions, be verified in the lab. And string theory and all these different interpretations are just combinations of those things. So they're using the things that we can verify at the hard science level and they're just combining them in a new way. And the combination can't be verified, but
Mhm.
all the pieces have been verified. Whereas morality, there doesn't seem to be any pieces. There's just essentially hypothetical stuff, and that's all you got. And in physics, those kinds of theories aren't accepted. They're not taught in schools. They're just pure making stuff up, essentially. And so, in the case of morality, I don't see the same parallel between the physics case. And my second question would be, what kind of classes are you advocating we teach? If it's just kind of like what atheists advocate for in the religious studies that we teach all the kids all the religions, and then they just decide for themselves, kind of a thing. And if that's the kind of moral class you're advocating for, I'm fine with that. But are you saying that there's some particular moral things we should be teaching as this is the right answer, and indicate that they should, on a test, this is the answer you should get to, and if you don't, you're wrong on this one, or something like that?
Yeah. So, yeah, so your first statement question had to do with the analogy with physics. I'm not quite sure what to do with that. I mean, I do see the analogy there. It seems to me that at a certain level, what you're operating with are human observations, right? I mean, so yes, you can generate observable data by running an experiment, but then the question is, well, what do people claim to have observed, right? And then what do we make of that, right? And so at a certain level, you are dealing with, you've got, sort of your input, your observational phenomena, and you've got human reception and interpretation. And you have the same thing in the moral domain. You've got cases where people have to make judgments or assessments or evaluations about what they are to do or what others ought to do. And then you have the human perception of those situations, and you have human interpretations or judgments about, well, here's how I see the situation. So I don't really see a massive disanalogy here that would ruin the sort of parallel that I'm suggesting.
Well, my objection here is that all of the moral facts seem to be best explained by it's a product of evolution, and the physics facts don't. That they're not a product of evolution.
Oh, I
They seem
see.
to be
Okay.
something independent of our imagination, of our psychology, of evolution, something true about everywhere in the universe. This is the case because of laws of physics. And so, saying that there is this truth or truthiness to morality seems to be claiming something completely different than there's a truth to gravity or something. And
Okay.
so, the fact there are these objective truths that we can demonstrate in the case
Hmm.
of physics doesn't seem to apply to morality.
Right. Okay. So you're proposing that evolution somehow facilitates what I would call the psychologizing of morality, that this is really just a sort of human projection onto the world. It's explained in terms of the actual architecture of our human bodies, especially our brains, right? And so we have these almost kind of like a, I don't know, Kantian notion that we have this conceptual grid built into our brains or something. We tend to think in moral terms, but it's not really part of what's out there. And I would say, well, why exactly should we think that just because, I mean, there are several responses I might want to make, but the first is, why should we think that just because something came about through evolution means that it's just a projection and not really a perceptual power to see what's out there? We could do the same thing with vision, right? Vision, human vision came about through evolution, right? And yet most of us are willing to say it reveals, at least in part, some of what's really out there. I'm not just projecting that there's, a mug here. I actually see it, and it's real. So why couldn't a moral sense be part of our evolutionary architecture, as opposed to a moral framework that projects, a moral sense that receives from the outside?
Or absolutely could be, but you need something independent of the sense to verify that. So you'd say like, if this
How,
sense I'm
how would
having
you?
corresponds to reality, then we're going to need to make like a novel testable prediction about something we're going to be able to observe in the future. Then we can be like, yes, this is more than just a mirage.
Mhm.
But if until we have that, like we do for physics, I don't think it's justified to conclude it is in fact a feature of reality yet.
Well, so yeah, I mean that's fair. If we are living lives rightly, there presumably would be some sort of output from that, some sort of result that would indicate that we're living our lives rightly, right? And so I don't know. I mean, you might take let's take Martin Luther King's moral beliefs and compare them to the moral beliefs of the woke, right? And ask, well, which have the better outcomes, right? And you can kind of look at that, and you might think, well, look, living life rightly should lead to something like flourishing for most, if not all, people, or something like that. So there should be an increase in flourishing for people if you're living life rightly. And I think that in those kinds of terms, now we can have debates about what actually constitutes human flourishing, and that's part of the problem, of course. But it seems to me that it's a pretty cut and dried um, set of observations here. That Martin Luther King's vision of the beloved community, and to the extent that he actually moved us toward that goal, um, constitutes a set of better outcomes than what we're seeing with wokeism. And that might constitute the kind of empirical validation that you're talking about.
I
But
don't think so. Like from because that leads to many counterintuitive problems. That's
mhm,
essentially just utilitarianism or consequentialism. Whatever works the best is the most moral, which I don't think applies. Like for example,
no, I wouldn't want to say it's consequentialist, right? So when we talk about flourishing, and this is a notion that comes out of a very ancient tradition, beginning with say Plato and Aristotle, right? This idea that um, the highest good for humans is the state of what they called eudaimonia, which is often nowadays translated flourishing or thriving. It used to be translated happiness until we put a subjective spin on that term. But flourishing or thriving. There are certain components of flourishing that are not just causal results, but that are constitutive of flourishing. Right. So we're looking not just at an outcome, but we're looking at a state of being, and it's the state of being considered in itself and not just as a consequence.
I don't know what that means exactly. So, like, if I think of, for example, the Buddhist monk who gives up all his possessions and lives homeless and starves to death,
Mm-hmm.
I would say him as morally superior to the billionaire capitalist guru. But the billionaire capitalist guru is going to have a much better life or more flourishing on essentially most metrics you could possibly measure.
Yeah.
And so I don't. It seems like in the definition of flourishing there, it's kind of circular in that whatever you define as flourishing is also going to be based on your already determined criterion of morality. So if you define something, this is moral, and
Mm-hmm.
based on that definition, you determine what flourishing is, well, then if someone just has an alternative definition of morality,
Mm-hmm.
each definition is going to provide their own preferred ideal amount of flourishing, and so everyone's going to have a different maximization of their flourishing level. And so again, you're not going to have a way to differentiate which ones are right or wrong here, unless you go with something like consequentialism. These people live more or something.
Well, sure, yeah, but even that presupposes a kind of evaluative judgment about best outcomes, right? So, yeah, I mean, you're right, and this kind of circularity, shall we say, I think is inescapable in some domains. Uh, for example, epistemology also, right? I mean, if you propose a standard of justification in epistemology, right, a standard of evidence, well, then it would seem that your standard of evidence must meet itself in order to be rationally believed, right? And so, oftentimes in philosophy, we come to a point where we do find ourselves caught in the kind of circle, but not all circles are vicious circles. It's one way of trying to escape from this and saying, well, look, if you have direct insight into the truth of a claim, then that might get you out of some sort of self-defeating circle. And so long as the circle isn't self-defeating, then it's not epistemically vicious. And I would say that the same is going to be true in terms of morality. So we want to, we don't want to let our ideology run roughshod over experience. And we want to try to be honest with ourselves and each other as we try to figure out what constitutes human flourishing and what kinds of beliefs perpetuate or lead to and perpetuate or maintain a state of flourishing, or at least as close as we can come to that. And so, what I'm saying is I don't deny that there's a kind of circularity here, but I would deny that there's a vicious circularity which necessarily pushes us into a kind of perspectivalism when it comes to morality. It seems to me that if we're open, honest, and cooperative with each other, we can find a lot of common ground. And then in cases where there are sticking points, disagreements, well, maybe that's a reason in some cases to back off of our claim to knowledge and say, well, okay, we want to think about this some more. Let's keep working on it together.
Well, I mean, the circularity part, I kind of partially agree. I think every hypothesis starts with, if my hypothesis is true, then obviously that's the circular part. Like, yeah, obviously you're gonna have to assume your hypothesis is true to make predictions. But the example you gave of like leading to more flourishing or something along those lines, that same example can be used for all things that we think are purely figments of people's imagination. Maybe a cultural trope, maybe wokeness, or political ideologies, sociological trends, hobbies, religions. You could just say, well, if this religion is true, it'll lead to flourishing. And then you say, well, that whatever culture you want to identify as the flourishing one, they're flourishing, therefore my hypothesis is true. And so I don't see that kind of prediction as telling us anything more than a psychological feature of humanity that we really like. And so I don't see that as giving us any grounds to think morality is more than a psychological feature that's a product of evolution, any more than it does religion or capitalism or wokeism.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it comes back to this fundamental ambiguity, where it's kind of, again, the vision example. You want to treat morality as if it's a projective feature of human nature, human being, right? And kind of on par with saying, well, your eyes just sort of, well, I don't know if project is the right word, but in receiving whatever input they receive from outside, they sort of change it and interpret it in a way that is distinctively human, or perhaps distinctively TJumpy. My visual system interprets or projects in a way that's distinctively Aaron-y or whatever. So you want to take that route, and I want to say, well, I'm not convinced. I think that we can think about both vision and morality in terms of a perceptual capacity to be aware of different kinds of facts. Visual facts in the one case, moral facts in another case. And it might be the case that our moral sense is less reliable than our visual sense. It might also be the case that the moral domain is simply a lot more difficult to wrangle with and a lot more subtle to work through in terms of figuring out what the facts are that we're perceiving. But that does not entail that it's just a sort of subjective projective sensibility that we have.
Well, sure. It wouldn't prove that that's the case, but if all of the epistemic grounds we have to justify morality also work for all of the other things we accept are purely psychological, political systems, economic systems, methodologies, whatever, wokeism, then it seems like it's rational to conclude it is just psychological until some greater means of evidence is provided to say it's above these other things that we think are pretty
What would you
psychological.
do with this? And this is a familiar problem. It's not anything new. But for those who try to take this kind of line, the idea that you can't really explain genuine normativity on the kind of descriptive basis that you're proposing, right? So this goes back to, I don't know, at least John Stuart Mill and others. This idea that, well, look, we can just give a sort of scientific description of where all this comes from, and well, but you're not actually getting prescriptivity into this. Science describes, it doesn't prescribe. Science doesn't find genuine oughts, it finds ises. And you want to say, well, the sense of ought is just some sort of weird non-truth tracking dimension of human psychology that nature has, for some, or I can't say for some reason, that nature has somehow built into us. And I want to say, well, why presume that? And how do you make sense of the idea of normativity in any case? Because if you can't account for normativity, then it seems to me that you're really just saying morality is an illusion. Like, even if you want to say, well, morality is somehow grounded in our evolutionary history, well, what's being grounded is a kind of illusory form of perception or sensibility. And, that's kind of I think, a recipe for disaster, personally and socially.
Well, even if that was the case, it wouldn't mean it wasn't true. So if it's a recipe for disaster, it could still be true. The consequences of it wouldn't make a difference.
Well,
But
that's fair.
your question about normativity, I think the oughtness is something we add. I don't think oughtness is entailed in morality at all. So I like to ask a question: Is something moral because we ought to do it, or ought we do it because it's moral?
Oh, we ought to do it because it's moral.
Right. I agree 100% there. And that's the Euthyphro dilemma. And the first horn of the dilemma, is something moral because we ought to do it, is essentially saying there is some category of morality and it's filled with a bunch of properties, and oughtness is one of the properties that is entailed in morality, which I think is false. I don't think that makes any sense. And the second one is we ought to do something because it's moral, means that the oughtness property is outside of the bubble of moral properties. So once we know whatever the moral properties are, we then apply this oughtness thing to those, but it's not actually intrinsic in any of the what's required for morality. So I think most of the people, except one professor, has answered that differently and said they're the same. But I tend to agree that we ought to do something because it's moral, which then means that oughtness isn't entailed in morality.
I want to finesse that a little bit, because the Euthyphro dilemma, as it actually occurs in the Euthyphro, isn't quite like that, right? It's is in this case the holy or the pious, is the holy holy because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because? So you're correlating a subjective attitude, right, with some sort of objective, presumably objective property. And I would say that being moral and being obligatory, I would say that obligation is part of the moral domain. It's not the whole of the moral domain. I mean, you've got the good, which I would take to be the primary sort of designation for the moral domain. And then you've got this narrower category of the obligatory, the ought. And it seems to me that oughts come into play when there's one unique good that stands out as being the uniquely choice-worthy good in a particular context. That's when you run into obligation. So I don't think this is the Euthyphro dilemma at all. Right?
Well, the point of the dilemma is just to say which is the more primary noun in the sentence. And so the Euthyphro dilemma is just saying here's noun X and here's noun Y. Is noun X more important or noun Y more important? And so the question is something moral because you ought to do it? And if that's what you just said seems to imply that would be the truth, the correct horn. It's moral because you ought to do it. Oughtness is somehow in one of the required properties for something to be moral. Obviously, it's not all of them, but it's one of them. And I tend to think the second case, we ought to do something because it's moral, tends to agree with my intuitions and most people's intuitions more, which seems to indicate that the oughtness really isn't entailed in the morality at all. It's something we just add on.
Yeah, I just don't see it that way. I almost want to say that there's a problem in the way you're framing the issue. Um, and here's how I think of it. Think about what major you might want to choose in college, or what career you might want to pursue, right?
Not philosophy.
Not philosophy. Well, that's fair, right? But I think we'd all agree that there are lots of potential majors and lots of potential careers that, for any given person, at least in the usual case, it would be perfectly moral for them to choose any one of them, right? So it's equally moral for me to have chosen to study philosophy or theology or classics or mathematics, right? These are equally good.
Well, I'd say they're amoral. I don't know why they would be moral.
Well, so my view is that knowledge, as a rule, so there may be some exceptions to this, but knowledge as a rule is certainly the stuff that we study in the university or study in our education system, historically considered, has been oriented toward the good. Why do we study mathematics? Well, because it's, first of all, good for us to know, but then it's also useful. And so it's good in itself, but it's also good for the sake of other things. So I do think that there is a linkage between knowledge and value. And in deciding what knowledge you want to devote yourself to acquiring, you are making a moral decision. Similarly, if you don't like knowledge, we can talk about, eating, vegetarianism versus eating meat, right? I mean, there is a moral question there. And no matter what side you come down on, it would be difficult to deny that there is a moral question there. All right, so here you've got living organisms, and some people want to say that it's morally okay to kill and eat them, and other people want to say it's not morally okay to kill and eat them. But it's a moral issue, regardless of what side you come down on. So let's just say that you are convinced that it's okay to eat meat. So you're, choosing what you're going to have for dinner, and you could either have a vegetarian meal or you could have a meat-based meal, and both are going to be equally good or equally morally acceptable from your perspective. But there might be special circumstances that make it obligatory for you to choose one rather than the other. So, for example, if you are in a culture where vegetarianism is the norm and it's perceived to be a moral issue, it might be the case. And, we can argue about the ins and outs here, but hopefully you can at least see the sense of what I'm about to say. And that is that it might be morally more important for you not to offend your hosts or the people you're visiting with than for you to indulge your desire to eat meat if they are vegetarians or if the culture is a vegetarian culture, right? So there it might be obligatory for you to restrict your choice and eat a vegetarian meal because there's a higher good of maintaining friendly relations with the people that you're visiting with, right? So I would see the obligatory as a special case of the morally good. When one morally good possibility stands out as uniquely choice-worthy, then obligated.
I don't quite follow how that would fit into my question. So,
Okay.
say you're right that it is more moral to eat the vegetables at a guest's house.
Mm-hmm.
Is it moral because you ought to do it, or ought you do it because it's moral? And I would say second one. Like, who cares? The ought's just irrelevant here. It's just that's the moral thing to do, and once we know it's the moral thing to do, I can then apply it.
Are you limiting the realm of the moral to the realm of the obligatory? Because then I would agree if that's the framework, but I don't. I mean, it seems to me that there are a number of things that are good but not obligatory.
No. So it's like the first horn is saying oughtness is one of the properties that makes something moral. It's not saying it's the only one. So
Mm-hmm.
is oughtness any one of the properties that makes something moral, or is something being moral what makes us ought to do it. And so the question is
And
is
this
oughtness
is
one of the
where
properties?
I think you and I have a fundamental difference of opinion about what constitutes the Euthyphro dilemma. And as I said earlier, something about the way you're setting this up seems to me to be sort of ill-conceived. I think the question is being wrongly put. Again, all I can say here, I mean, if you're interpreting the, is it this or is it this because of that or that because of this? I would say, well, look, I mean, on my view, anything that's generally obligatory must be moral because it's a special case of the moral for me, right? So nothing can be obligatory without being moral, right? But it's not quite the either or that you're suggesting, right? So when I say yes, it's obligatory because it's moral, I'm thinking of being moral as a necessary but not a sufficient condition for being obligatory. In order to be obligatory, it must be moral, but then it also must be uniquely choice-worthy in a particular context. And that's how I'm thinking of obligation. And you seem to be thinking about it in a different way. And I'd need to know more about that. But I don't know that I can receive your either or Euthyphro dilemma style question in the way you intend it, given the way I understand obligation.
Well, so I can grant that. I can say that this question only applies to the cases of morality in which they're obligatory. So if there are other cases of morality that are non-obligatory, the question is not in respect to those whatsoever. It's irrelevant to those. So this is only in the cases where there is an obligation. Is that moral thing, is it moral because it entails this obligation? Or do we have this obligation because we know it's moral? We know it's
Okay.
moral first, and then we say, okay, well, now I know it's moral, we apply an obligation. Or is it moral because it entails the obligation?
Yeah. Okay. So let me try this on. And I'm not trying to play games here. I'm just trying to fit myself into your framework as best I can. All right. So it seems to me like I can affirm either horn of the dilemma, so long as I can add some qualifications, right? And so I can say, well, it's obligatory because it's moral, in the sense that, well, it's being moral is a necessary condition of its being obligatory, but it requires more. It has to be moral, but uniquely choice-worthy in that particular setting. Well, can I also affirm the other horn of the dilemma and say that it's moral because it's obligatory? Well, in a sense, I mean, there's a sense in which if you don't do what's obligatory, then you are doing something that is immoral, right? So there's a sense in which, okay, in that particular context, it's the only moral thing you could do, and everything else would be in a certain sort of way immoral. I mean, we have these cases where something is not immoral in itself, but it might be wrong in the context, right? So again, like eating meat, right? If we are agreed that eating meat is not immoral, but it might be immoral in the context, then I can affirm in that sense that, okay, in this case, it's moral because it's obligatory, right? Because it's a moral option and it's uniquely choice-worthy, it's obligatory, and because it's obligatory, doing anything else in that particular context would be immoral on some level, would be wrong, right? But then we make this distinction between what's the right thing to do in the context versus what's the right thing to do, or what's morally allowable in itself. And in terms of the in itself, I want to say, well, all of these options are moral, but in the particular context, I want to say this is the uniquely choice-worthy good.
Could
Does
you
that
walk me through
make
that one more time? So I'm not quite following there. Like
okay?
the oughtness and how it relates seems to be superfluous to me. Like I don't think we need the oughtness of any kind. As you say, we know it's moral. So once we know it's moral, then the oughtness does no sufficient work there. So like I'd say that it's moral to eat vegetarian. I think it's immoral to kill animals. So I'm
Okay.
agree with the vegetarians. So
Okay.
it's immoral to it's immoral to eat meat because you're
Mhm.
violating something's consent. It was a living being of some kind. And it's also moral to acquiesce to the desires of your host because
Mhm.
that's their house or whatever.
Mhm.
But I don't think I need the oughts in any of that. I don't think I need to add ought to any of those things.
Can you think of a situation where there would be multiple goods that
Yes.
you could choose from, and there would be no obligation to
Yes.
choose any particular one?
Yes.
So give me an example of that, one that you would accept, and let's see if
My
that
f-
relates
my
anything.
f- my friend would like a Coke and a Coke and some popcorn. I choose to give him neither. Both of those would be moral. It'd be moral for me to give him a Coke, and it'd be moral for me to give him both Coke and popcorn, but I'm obligated to do neither.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So would there be any conditions under which one of those options would become obligatory?
I don't think so.
Wh-
Unless
What
I
about,
have
so,
agreed to a like if I have agreed to a contract, like I said,
mhm,
I have agreed under my consent to abide by this set of rules. And
mhm,
then there's something where I have to do something in
mhm.
accordance with those rules, then I would be obligated, not based off of morality, but based off of my agreeing to this set of rules. So I
What
have
about a
bound myself.
situation where you two were, I don't know, dying of thirst in the desert, and you have two Cokes? Would you be obligated to give one to him?
No,
No, you could keep them both for yourself. And see, now I think I would disagree.
it wouldn't be immoral for me to keep both for myself. If they're my Cokes, it wouldn't be immoral, but
Mm,
it would be moral for me to give him one.
mhm,
It would be amoral for me to do nothing.
mhm.
But it wouldn't be immoral. The immoral thing there, I think, would be nature. Nature causing us to die would be immoral. But I didn't commit the immoral action by not giving him the Coke.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I did watch one of your videos where you were talking about that view about, nature being immoral, and so that's
Yeah.
interesting. I don't know quite what to say about that, but it's an interesting view. Yeah, and so I don't know. Here we have a fundamental disagreement. I think my sense is that the facts of the situation arrange themselves there, where I really ought to share what I have, um, and if I don't, that's a moral failing on my part. But you disagree, and so we could talk about that and try to figure out why we disagree, and maybe that would be illuminating, and maybe it wouldn't. I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah. For me, it just doesn't. The words don't make sense to me when you say you're obligated or you should give the Coke to someone. That
Hmm.
doesn't like make sense in my mind what that means.
Okay. Okay.
Whereas it makes sense for me that there's an immoral action there. I think that any violation of consent is immoral. So us dying of thirst is immoral.
Hmm.
But obviously, I didn't cause that. You didn't cause that. Something caused that, and it was nature. So the
Hmm.
immoral action took place. Nature did it. And now the question is what would it mean for me to be obligated to share my Coke with you, essentially? And I can't make sense of that in the context of ought. Now, it's moral for me to share my Coke with you, absolutely. You have a desire for Coke. If I give you a Coke, that's assisting your voluntary assistance of your will. That's moral. If I punch you in the face, that's involuntary restriction of will. That's immoral. But if they're already my Cokes, then I'm not obligated to give you a Coke.
Hmm.
If one of them was yours and I stole it, that would be immoral. So in that case, if we thought of both of the Cokes, one of them was yours and one of them was mine, then obviously if I took both, that would be immoral.
Yeah. Yes. So it's interesting. I mean, you seem to be operating with an implicit, and I'm sure you could make it explicit if we turn to that, but an implicit um, view about private property and ownership in the background as being a strong plank in your moral platform, right? And I guess I would hold that to be less dear. I think that private property has its place and ownership rights have their place, but I don't think they're absolute. And I think that again, it depends on the particulars of the situation, but it seems to me that those are far from absolute, and that in certain cases it is incumbent morally upon people to share what they have with others.
So the reason I wouldn't agree with that is because if we think about hypothetically the best way the world could be, the most perfect, morally perfect world.
Hmm.
In that world, you'd never be obligated to give away a Coke because
Hmm.
everyone could just snap their fingers and get a Coke. You get
Hmm.
it whatever you
Okay.
need by fiat. And so that doesn't seem to be a core tenet of morality. It seems to be a pragmatic thing that because we have limited resources, we apply this extra set of obligations there.
Hmm.
But if those limited resources things were gone, then this
Hmm.
wouldn't be a relevant concern for morality. It's only the only reason that this is a relevant concern is because of our subjective limitations given this context. And so
Hmm.
I don't think it's relevant to what objectively morality actually is. I think
Hmm.
it's purely a contingent, subjective moral sentiment that we apply because of our pragmatic limitations.
So that's interesting. I would agree with a lot of what you said there, but I wouldn't want to take it in the direction of subjectivism. I'd want to say this moral obligation is contingent. It's not necessary. It's not, true in all possible worlds, that kind of thing. It's contingent upon the particular circumstances of the case. But in those circumstances, it is true and just as valid as, well, let's just, take the idea that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade, right? Is that an absolute? Well, no,
No.
it kind of depends on what, your elevation, right? And
Yeah. If you're
so,
in space, it instantly boils when it goes outside.
right. So it's kind of like, well, okay. So, but is that any less factual? That it's still factual, even though it's contingent. So that's kind of how I think about these obligations that are not, say, universally and necessarily applicable. And I agree with you that, like, in a world where there was no scarcity of the resources necessary for flourishing, you would probably not encounter obligations to share with others. I say probably only as a guard against things that I can't think of at the moment. There might be some weird case that you might think of and throw at me. So I'm trying to be careful there. But probably you wouldn't have obligations, and that would be fine. And there could still be lots of goods attained. In fact, that would be, you'd have more good attained in a state where it was just, perpetual flourishing with ease for everybody, right? I mean, that's sort of the ideal. But if we get there, great. I'm not sharing my Coke with you, but and you won't have any need of it, right? I don't know. I mean, but you might also. Well, let me now reverse what I just said. So there might actually be an interesting class of goods that are attainable only in sharing goods with others. This kind of gets away from obligation, though, so we don't need to take the conversation in that direction. But that's all.
Well, yeah, I would actually agree with you there, but I'd say that that's in a world with infinite resources, that's possible because you can limit your own resources by consent. So you can
Right.
deliberately turn up the difficulty on a video game, or
Yeah.
you could just like turn on God mode and you're invincible. And so you can artificially limit your resources, and then people can still give you the resources, and so that would still be possible. But to me, I see a conflict between the morality of giving someone a Coke and having some obligation that you're supposed to give someone a Coke. That seems
Mhm.
immoral to me. It seems like immoral that you are obligated to give someone your Coke
Mm.
against your consent. So that seems like a kind of
Well,
forcing.
let's eliminate the against your consent sort of thing. I mean, so I would say that when you're faced with a situation like this, and here I'm thinking, you said the language poses a problem for you earlier, the terminology, and I don't know how much weight to put on the way you phrased that, but I think less in terms of language and more in terms of phenomenology, more in terms of the experience, right? What am I experiencing in this situation? If you and I were wandering through the desert and I had two Cokes and you had none, and we were both getting to the point where we're extremely thirsty and, perhaps even beyond thirsty, we're really, physically suffering now from dehydration, I would feel not, and even without you saying anything or, laying a guilt trip on me or anything, I would feel something that was, I don't know how to put this other than in sort of metaphorical terms, saying to me, share your Coke with TJump. This would be and I would interpret that as an internal perception of an external reality that there has arisen a demand in the situation itself. It does not derive from you or from me or from any person making a demand. The situation makes the demand on me. And it's not going to coerce me. I can reject it, but that would constitute a violation of my obligation to you under those circumstances, and I would have to live with that. So, take coercion out of the picture. I think there are still obligations that constitute moral facts, even contingent moral facts, in particular situations.
Well, in the case of you having that feeling, that would not pose a conflict for me because you're the one who has the feeling and you would be the one acquiescing to that feeling. But let's say there's a psychopath that does not have that feeling. Now
Mm-hmm.
you're saying the obligation exists for that person too.
Yes.
And this is where I see a conflict because I think their will to have
Mm-hmm.
both of their cokes is morally valuable. And
Mm-hmm.
something in the universe saying that they're not allowed to have those cokes or they have to give up a coke or otherwise they're under some punishment, whether it's just being labeled immoral or something,
Mm-hmm.
seems itself to be immoral. It seems like if there is some
Mm-hmm.
obligation that they must violate their will
Mm-hmm.
without consent, then that whatever is doing that must be immoral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And here's where another place where we're going to disagree. Even though I find your view that nature is somehow immoral, or at least when it causes us to suffer and have problems and conflict with our will and so on, I find it intriguing.
Age,
I
weight
don't.
gain.
Yeah, exactly right. Shake my fist at the universe. Right. Yeah. No. But I have a hard time saying that that's immoral. And so that won't be any surprise to you because, as you know, that's an unusual view that you hold, and I don't know that I'm prepared to attempt to refute it. I'm not sure I can, but I do see things differently, and so I would exempt nature from the category of the moral in that regard. But that aside, you know, it's very difficult when you're dealing with these situations where, because I want to affirm that human will has incredible moral value, and I do think that part of the purpose of human life, and here I'm going beyond a merely evolutionary view, of course, but part of the purpose of human life is for us to develop ourselves morally, and that can be in a positive or good direction, or it could also be in a negative direction. Um, and there's something to be said about the value of free will. It's so valuable that it's not wrong to allow people to make themselves into moral monsters. Exactly. All right. Now, when they become moral monsters, there's a question about what we do with them, and then that sort of gets to your question about punishment and so on. But so I want to affirm there's something right about what you said. I can't go all the way with you, but our disagreements may not be as thoroughgoing as one might imagine from the fact that I'm going to say, no, it's okay. This person did do something wrong, and punishment is not necessarily wrong. There might be better things than punishment. There might, correction of some sort, and an opportunity for the person to make amends. That might be better than punishment, but some sort of response to the moral facts on the ground, including the fact that this person has made a wrong choice by failing to fulfill an obligation, or refusing, in this case, to fulfill an obligation. And you raised the case of the psychopath. I mean, you've got to think then hard about, well, does that somehow exempt the person from responsibility? Right? I mean, if they can't see their own obligations because nature has rendered them blind to their obligations, should they be held to the same standards? These are difficult questions.
Yeah, my
But
initial thought is
go ahead.
like when I said punishment, I'm specifically referring to the obligation itself. The obligation seems to be a punishment. So if you don't fulfill an obligation, you are punished by being labeled immoral. That seems
Mm-hmm.
to be a punishment. And that in and of itself, I think, seems to be immoral. So if you are pursuing your own will,
Mm-hmm.
and if by doing that, um, without directly imposing on somebody else's will,
Mhm.
I don't think it's moral for reality to be able to label you as immoral or be able to say you violated some obligation that you had. To me, that in and of itself seems to be immoral.
So making moral judgments is itself immoral, unless it's a positive judgment.
Well, no,
Is
no.
that
So, like, I'd say that there's some fact of the matter. Like, if you punch someone in the face, you are immoral because you violated their consent. But if
Mhm.
you haven't done anything to violate their consent, then I don't think you can be labeled immoral for inaction. Inaction would be amoral.
Oh, okay,
And
okay.
so, if nature labels you as immoral for inaction, that seems
Mhm.
to be immoral. It seems like you're doing something immoral there. By they just did nothing. You can't say they're immoral for doing nothing. They just did nothing.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess I'm inclined to think. Well, obviously, I see the situation differently, and I'm inclined to think that you are maybe putting too high a value on human individual autonomy, free will. I mean, it has a great value. I've affirmed that, but in terms of a scale of values, I wouldn't say it's the highest. But you want to attach a much greater value than I do to human free will. I don't think it's always immoral to thwart human free will.
Well,
Would
I
you
would
also
agree.
apply this? Okay, okay. So you'd
So,
agree.
like,
So
if someone's trying to kill someone else, sorting them is a moral action because you've saved the other person.
okay.
But like if I'm thinking of it, here's a random question for you. Do you think a morally perfect world, how does that compare to the perfect world? The morally perfect world to the perfect world. Do those sound like synonyms to you?
They do sound like synonyms to me. So I don't know. Keep talking and tell me more about if you see a distinction there. Keep talking,
I
and
do.
I'll tell you
So
if I see a distinction too as you elaborate.
yeah, so if a morally perfect world and you only apply moral agency to humans and human actions, then a morally perfect world wouldn't eliminate tornadoes, death, aging, any of that stuff. And
Mhm.
so a morally perfect world is significantly less perfect than a perfect world.
Okay.
But I tend to share the intuition that a morally perfect world is synonymous with a perfect world. But given your definition of morality, it seems like there's a quite a significant difference between the two.
How does this fit with your view that nature can be immoral when it thwarts human will? So, tornadoes destroying my my home, that's against my will.
Yes, I would count that as immoral, 100%. The tornado in nature is immoral for doing that.
Okay,
I would
so
say
wouldn't
that
wouldn't but so can nature be immoral and still constitute a perfect world?
no,
That
that would
sounded
be
like what you were saying.
no. A perfect
No?
world would include
Oh.
a morally perfect world would,
Mhm.
based on your definition of morality, where nature isn't involved, would just
I see.
entail human beings being not hurtful to one another. But that would include death.
Oh, I
There'd still
see.
be tornadoes. So
Mhm.
a morally perfect world based on your definition would
Mhm.
include tornadoes.
Yeah.
Based on my definition, there would be no tornadoes unless you
Yeah.
wanted a tornado. So
Right.
by my definition, it would include no involuntary impositions of consent, no tornadoes, earthquakes, death, aging. That is what I would see as the morally perfect world. So for me, they're synonymous. Morally perfect and perfect are synonymous. But based
Mhm.
on your definition, they're not synonymous.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
that's why I
okay.
initially asked the question is like,
Yeah.
does a morally
I thought
perfect world sound like a perfect world? Do those sound
right.
synonymous?
And
Because
I said they do, right? And
yeah,
you want to say there's an inconsistency. And I guess, I mean, this gets into um, deeper issues, I suppose, or it shifts the field a bit in my mind. And we then need to start talking about where so-called natural evil comes from, right? When we're dealing with, so this, in my mind, this shifts the ground into a sort of theological or philosophy of religion type of domain for me. And thinking about the problem of evil, deal with the problem of moral evil. We usually make a distinction, deal with the problem of natural evil as a distinct issue. And there's an ongoing debate in the history of this discussion as to whether natural evil is reducible to moral evil or not, or whether it has its roots in moral evil. Right. So, is it is all that's going wrong for humans in our world ultimately the result of sin? Right. That kind of thing. And I would take the view that it is. So, and I know you're going to want to jump all over me for
well,
that.
God did some things, and I don't know if I agree with those things, but
But,
I would take a different route. I would say that if we look at the evidence, because I'm a determinist, so I don't think there's free
Okay.
will, which means saying that a tornado is wrong is pretty close to synonymous to saying a person is wrong. Because if they
Mm,
have a brain tumor and that causes them to be a pedophile or whatever, because we actually have a case of that,
mhm.
then that person can't be said to be morally responsible. It was the brain tumor.
Right.
And we know that even if there's no brain tumor, your actions are going to be predetermined by your neurology.
Mm,
And so if it's a particular way your brain is developed over time, that is equally as much as culpable as the brain tumor is,
mm,
which is equally as culpable as the tornado is. And so if determinism is true, then we don't have this kind of free will culpability thing. And so it seems if morality can apply to us, then it would also apply to tornadoes. Anything that violates wills would be that way. And it seems like we're making strides towards that. There are moral theories that say violating any kind of life is immoral, even if it doesn't have consciousness. Or um, it seems like our scope of morality is increasing to be more based on the impacts of people rather than the intents of people. And if that pattern continues, the end goal would be something like just saying, once we solved morality for humans and humans are no longer evil to one another, would we stop using the word morality at all, or would it evolve into this further stage where morality applies to any kind of involuntary imposition by nature? And I think it will tend towards that usage in the future.
mm. Okay, interesting view. This question came up as you were talking through that, and it's a little bit of an aside, I suppose. But why do you place such a premium on consent if you don't believe in free will? If it's just consent itself is going to be a predetermined outcome based on your neurology and traceable back to presumably, I don't know, the Big Bang or something like that, right?
Well, I follow the evidence. So, based on my understanding of the evidence of morality, moral intuition, and moral progress, I essentially just plot out the data points and try to describe a principle that describes the pattern and seems to be will based.
Oh, okay. So this is just a descriptive idea that morality only applies with. Well, no, you won't be able to say. So I'm still not following. Why? Which data points are you plotting that leads you to the conclusion that anything that violates human will or consent is immoral?
So, following moral intuition that drowning babies is bad, helping old
Mhm,
ladies is good. It seems like the criterion of what morality applies to is some wills of some kind.
mhm, mhm,
And moral progress shows that the scope of those wills changes. So, like
mhm.
in the past, we saw women's rights, LGBT rights, workers'
Mhm.
rights, animal rights.
Okay.
The scope of morality is increasing as we gain
Mhm,
more resources or intelligence or whatever.
mhm.
The things to which morality applies grows.
Okay.
And as we also gain in the other things I mentioned about more determinism, that's the
Mhm,
consensus or the leading view
mhm, mhm,
of that the material world is all there is as far as we know.
mhm.
um, when we apply moral language to humans, because if all we are is deterministic forces, then the level of culpability is significantly lessened than compared to libertarian free will. And so we can't really say that the person who has the brain tumor is morally culpable. And
Right.
for the same reason, we can't really say that the guy who has a bad neurology is morally culpable. And so if we follow these kinds of progress of the scope of morality increasing and the culpability decreasing,
Mhm.
then that would lead to the extreme of any involuntary imposition of will is immoral.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't see why it leads to that rather than just a declaration that human life is amoral. And this is, the language of morality is just a weird little language game that we've come up with to articulate our subjective um, perception or construal of certain situations, even if that's biologically grounded and foisted upon most of us who have, typical neurology. So yeah,
Right, that
it's
would definitely be one of the interpretations for sure. But suppose
okay.
moral realism was true, what
Mhm.
version of moral realism would,
Okay. Okay.
if we followed this pattern, what version of moral realism would be the
Would
outcome?
fit.
And this is
Yeah.
the one. And I
Okay.
make predictions. I say that
Yeah. Yeah.
right now, all the evidence we have, it indicates
Mhm.
evolution, but I believe that if we discover other species and artificial intelligences, they're going to discover, or they're going to produce a similar pattern in moral intuitions and moral progress. And if that's the case all over the universe, then this is probably, it must necessarily be something more than evolutionary, in which case we have good reason to believe that it's a more than an evolutionary trend.
Okay. Well, that's super interesting. I don't agree, but that's really, and I respect the attempt to sort of come up with a moral realist view that fits the facts as you understand them. That's pretty impressive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we've been going for about an hour and 15 minutes.
Oh wow, time flies when you're having fun.
Absolutely, it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed the conversation. Do you want to give any links or references, websites where people can find out more about your work and where to find you?
Well, I don't personally have a website, but you can find some of my work referenced online if you just Google my name and philosophy, I suppose. The book Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. If it's not one that I would recommend to folks who aren't academic philosophers, but I believe the first chapter, which is pretty accessible, is available as a preview from Routledge. If folks wanted to check that out, just Google the title and Routledge and it should come up.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I hope you
Thanks
have a
for
wonderful
having
day.
me. You too. Take care.
See ya.
Bye.